From the heart of Africa, Burkina Faso shines anew.
The Africa Spoke. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful African stories.
Have you ever imagined living in a place where water is worth more than gold? Literally? Where a single drop could decide whether your family eats, whether your child stays in school, or whether your entire village survives another year? That's not a scene from some apocalyptic movie. It's the daily reality in country region name. Here, the groundwater level drops by nearly 1 meter every single year. The rainy season lasts barely 6 weeks, and then the land cracks open under a 113-degree sun. Between 2019 and 2024, the number of people facing severe food shortages almost quadrupled, from 700,000 to 2.7 million. Nearly 80% of the population depends on rain-fed farming, so when the sky fails, millions go hungry. In some years, poor rainfall has erased over 500,000 tons of crops in a single season, pushing more than 2.8 million people into hunger. Meanwhile, in the U.S., even in severe droughts, there are emergency water reserves, advanced irrigation, and federal aid programs to keep farms running and food on shelves. But here, when the rain doesn't come, nothing comes. The safety net doesn't exist. So here's the question. What would you do if the very sky stopped providing for you? Would you wait? Or would you rewrite the rules of survival itself? You might wonder, how does a nation end up here? How does a country reach a point where the mere absence of rain becomes a national emergency? The truth is, this crisis didn't appear overnight. Decades of environmental decline have been stacking the odds against survival. Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation in the heart of the Sahel, sits in one of the harshest climate zones on Earth. Nearly 70% of its land is desert or barren rock. Temperatures often stay above 104 degrees, 40 degrees Celsius, for weeks at a time. The soil, once fertile in pockets, has been stripped bare by overuse, deforestation, and relentless winds. Historically, the rainy season here lasted up to 3 months. Today, it's down to just 6 to 8 weeks, and the rain often comes all at once, washing away topsoil instead of nourishing crops. According to the World Bank, average annual rainfall in some regions has dropped by 20% over the last 50 years. And when it does rain, up to 30% of the water is lost immediately to runoff, because the ground can no longer absorb it. This pattern has devastating consequences. In the early 1980s, one of the worst droughts in the Sahel's history left over 1.5 million people across the region in desperate need of food aid. For Burkina Faso, it marked the start of a cycle: famine, foreign aid, short-term recovery, and then back to crisis. Meanwhile, think about how drought plays out in the U.S. Take California, for example. In 2014 to 2015, when the state faced its worst drought in over a century, farmers still managed to produce billions in crops thanks to vast irrigation networks, groundwater pumping, and state-level drought relief funding. Here in Burkina Faso, none of that infrastructure exists at scale. There's no federal water reserve, no national pipeline network, no multi-billion-dollar subsidies. When the rain stops, everything stops. And the economic toll? It's staggering. Agriculture makes up about 30% of Burkina Faso's GDP, yet it's entirely dependent on rainfall. One failed season can wipe out years of progress. In 2011, a poor rainy season cut cereal production by 19%, forcing the country to import emergency grain, much of it donated by foreign governments and NGOs. By 2018, over 40% of rural households were spending more than half their income just to buy food. So the problem isn't just the climate, it's dependency. Dependency on rain, on foreign aid, on the hope that next season will be better. But history shows the opposite. The seasons are getting shorter, the rain's less reliable, and the population, now over 22 million, is growing fast. Which brings us to the turning point. When faced with a cycle that's been repeating for decades, one leader decided it was time to break it, no matter the cost. Every movement has a face, a person who carries not just the responsibility, but the weight of an entire nation's hope. For Burkina Faso, that face is Ibrahim Traoré. To understand why this man has become a symbol, you need to know where he comes from. Traoré wasn't born into wealth or power. He grew up in a small rural community where the closest well was several kilometers away. As a boy, he spent hours each day carrying heavy jerry cans back to his family's home. Sometimes he'd miss school for days during the dry season because finding water was more urgent than learning. By his teenage years, he was already helping dig shallow wells by hand. He's told stories of sharing a single plate of food with his mother, of slaughtering the family's only goat to trade for a sack of rice. For many, these might be memories of hardship to forget. For him, they became fuel, a constant reminder of what was at stake. In the U.S., leaders often rise through political ranks, backed by influential donors, corporate networks, and years of formal campaigning. Traoré's rise was nothing like that. His ascent was forged in the dirt, in the literal trenches of rural life. His political capital didn't come from TV ads or polished speeches. It came from standing shoulder to shoulder with people who had nothing, sharing in their struggles and refusing to look away. And when he took office, he made one thing clear. Burkina Faso would no longer beg for survival. No IMF loans with strings attached. No foreign contracts that hand over control of the country's most vital resources. No deals that trade sovereignty for short-term relief. But here's the twist. His vision wasn't just to patch up the water crisis with small-scale fixes. He wanted to rewrite the nation's geography. He envisioned something so big, so audacious, that many called it impossible. A man-made river, hundreds of kilometers long, cutting through the desert to bring life where there had only been dust. Some dismissed it as a fantasy. Others feared it would be too expensive, too ambitious, too risky. But for Traoré, it wasn't about whether it was risky. It was about whether the country could survive without it. Because he knew one thing. Without water, there's no food. Without food, there's no stability. And without stability, no nation, no matter how proud, can stand on its own. Imagine redrawing the map of your country, not with borders, but with water. Traoré's answer to decades of drought and dependency was unlike anything Burkina Faso had ever attempted. A 276-kilometer artificial canal, wide enough for 4 trucks to drive side by side. Not just a channel for water, but a new artery for the nation. The plan was meticulous. The canal would start in the northern highlands, where underground springs and aquifers could be tapped and stored in a massive reservoir holding tens of millions of cubic meters of water. From there, solar-powered pumping stations would push the flow southward, irrigating over 500,000 hectares of farmland, land that had been unproductive for decades. Along the route, every 5 kilometers, smaller branch canals would spread like veins, carrying water directly to villages and crop fields. Tens of thousands of drought-resistant trees, acacia, neem, baobab, would be planted along its banks, shielding the water from wind and reducing evaporation. Some sections would even be topped with floating solar panels, doubling as both an energy source and a protective shade. In the U.S., large-scale water projects like the Central Arizona Project or California's State Water Project cost billions, involve decades of planning, and often rely on public-private partnerships with access to advanced engineering firms. In contrast, Traoré's plan called for 0 foreign loans. The $500 million budget would be funded entirely through the country's gold reserves, a national savings fund, and contributions from citizens, every household encouraged to invest the price of a seed for a future harvest. But here's what set it apart even more. This wasn't just about farming. The canal was designed to be an ecosystem in itself. Grazing pastures would be created between the tree lines. Fisheries would be introduced in the reservoirs. Agricultural training centers would spring up along the banks, teaching farmers to use water efficiently and grow drought-resistant crops. It wasn't just water they were channeling, it was knowledge, jobs, and independence. Critics, both domestic and international, were quick to point out the challenges. The risk of evaporation in the extreme heat, the logistical nightmare of building across such harsh terrain, and the sheer scale of the project for a nation with limited infrastructure. But for Traoré, the real risk was doing nothing and watching another generation grow up in thirst. You don't build a 276-kilometer canal in the middle of the Sahel without making waves, political ones. From the moment the first blueprint was made public, opposition began to surface, not from the farmers whose fields would be revived, but from across the ocean. Several European newspapers labeled it the fanciful dream of an inexperienced government. International financial institutions offered preferential loan frameworks, but tucked inside were clauses granting them decision-making power over water flow, priority access to resources, and annual technical fees that could drain millions from the project's budget. In the U.S., large-scale infrastructure debates often split along political lines: cost versus necessity, environmental impact versus economic benefit. Here, the split wasn't domestic politics, it was sovereignty. Traoré made it clear in Parliament: if we let others build this canal, the water will not flow according to the will of Burkina Faso. It will flow according to the will of the contract. The chamber erupted in applause, but not everyone outside the country was clapping. Criticism grew sharper. Foreign media ran stories suggesting the project was underfunded. The water would evaporate before reaching the fields, and farmers weren't truly supportive. Some used images of temporary, unlined sections of the canal to paint it as a shoddy effort. A leaked report from a European think tank even stated, if this project succeeds, it will set a dangerous precedent. Other nations may choose to self-finance major infrastructure without international loans, reducing our influence in Africa. What they didn't expect was how the government would respond, not with defensive press releases, but with full transparency. National TV showed both the triumphs and the setbacks: sections that collapsed and were rebuilt, pumps that failed and were replaced, heavy rains that slowed progress. Instead of eroding trust, it built it. People saw the flaws, but also the will to overcome them. In the U.S., transparency is often demanded, but rarely given in real time. What do you think? Would American taxpayers trust a billion-dollar project more if they saw every mistake and fix on live TV? If you agree, drop your thoughts in the comments and share this story. How do you get an entire nation, not just its government, to dig a river through the desert? You make it their river. From day one, Traoré framed the canal not as a government project, but as a national mission. The One Seed, One Drop campaign called on every citizen to contribute the cost of at least one seed toward the canal's construction. It wasn't just symbolic. Tens of thousands of small contributions added up to millions of dollars. Farmers, market vendors, teachers, miners, each became a literal stakeholder in the country's future water supply. To keep momentum, the government staged canal days along the route. Schools brought students to plant trees by the banks. Local bands performed at groundbreaking ceremonies. Every completed phase was celebrated with open-air gatherings where residents could walk the new sections, touch the concrete, and imagine the water that would soon flow there. This wasn't just PR. It was nation-building. In the U.S., large infrastructure projects rarely invite the public onto the construction site, let alone make them active participants. Here, community involvement wasn't a side benefit. It was the fuel. People didn't just watch progress, they became part of it. And then came the moment that turned the project from a national story into a continental one. On one Canal Day, national TV broadcast Traoré, no suit, no podium, standing in the mud, shovel in hand, next to the same workers who had been digging for weeks. At noon, when the call to prayer echoed, excavators fell silent, mats were rolled out beside the freshly dug bank, and hundreds prayed together under the blistering sun. The image spread across African social media like wildfire. No foreign logos on helmets, no handshakes with diplomats. Just a flag, a shovel, and the people. African news outlets dubbed it the miracle of the Sahel. Ghanaian papers compared it to building a great green wall, but with water. Farmers from Mali, Niger, and Benin sent letters proposing to link future canals across borders. The hashtag Canal276 trended in multiple countries within 48 hours. Imagine if the U.S. interstate highway system had been built with ordinary Americans physically helping to lay the asphalt, plant the trees, and shape the land. Would it have meant more to them than just another government project? If you think community ownership changes everything, hit like, share, and let us know your thoughts below. Big dreams look perfect on paper until they meet the dirt, the heat, and the clock. Halfway through the build, the desert pushed back. In the north, sudden torrential rains tore through embankments like paper. In the south, delivery trucks carrying polymer lining got stuck for days in washed-out roads. By week's end, the schedule was behind by 23 days. Was this a surprise? Not to the engineers. You can't carve 276 kilometers through the Sahel without the Sahel fighting back, one of them told a local reporter. But the headlines outside the country? Brutal. Unrealistic. Collapsing before completion. Political theater. Here's the unusual part. Traoré didn't call a press conference to spin the story. He put the failures on national TV. Unlined trenches, broken pumps, crews redigging collapsed sections, broadcast in primetime. The message wasn't "everything's fine," it was, "This is what building in the real world looks like, and here's how we fix it." Contrast that with the US, where most mega-project setbacks are buried in quarterly reports. Imagine if the public could see each flaw as it happened. Would it erode trust or build it? Then came the heat wave. 5 days straight above 118 degrees, 48 degrees Celsius. In uncovered stretches, evaporation devoured nearly 9 out of every 10 gallons before the water reached the next checkpoint. International critics seized on the numbers. Proof the canal will never work. But 2 weeks later, satellite images told a different story. Sections shimmering under newly installed floating solar arrays. Evaporation losses plunged by over 90%, and those panels were now powering extra pumps. It was a quiet counterpunch, but a decisive one. And here's where the controversy sharpened. Some foreign outlets suggested the fix was copied from projects abroad, implying Burkina Faso lacked innovation. Local engineers pushed back hard. Yes, the technology existed elsewhere, but adapting it to withstand Sahel winds and heat required rethinking the entire design. "You can import ideas," one said, "but the will to adapt them, that's ours." So what do you think? If a country takes an idea, reshapes it, and makes it work where others said it couldn't, does that count as innovation? Drop your thoughts below and share this with someone who still doubts the power of adaptation. Some moments are so rare, they burn themselves into a nation's memory forever. It happened just after sunrise. The air was already hot enough to shimmer over the sand. People had been gathering for hours, farmers in worn hats, children clutching metal cups, elders leaning on walking sticks. They all stood along the dry trench, waiting for something most had never seen in their lifetime: moving water in the middle of the Sahel. At exactly 9:17 a.m., a ripple appeared at the far end, then a rush, then a roar. Within minutes, the canal was alive, glittering, surging, unstoppable. Women dipped their hands in, laughing through tears. Boys splashed each other, cups overflowing. An old man knelt, let the water wash over his calloused hands, and whispered, "We've been waiting for this for 50 years. The numbers made it even more staggering. That day alone, over 30 million gallons began flowing south. Within 48 hours, branch canals reached their first 20 villages. Fields that had been bare for decades darkened as the soil drank deep. Local radio stations broke from their schedules just to broadcast the sound of water moving through the new channels. From a U.S. perspective, it's almost impossible to imagine this level of collective euphoria over infrastructure. In America, a new pipeline or waterway might make headlines, but rarely does it bring tens of thousands into the streets in celebration. Here, it was as if a second Independence Day had arrived. Only this time, the freedom was from thirst. And then came the unexpected twist. People began naming sections of the canal. Some were after villages, others after historic battles, and a few after beloved teachers, doctors, or community leaders. Maps started appearing online with these unofficial names marked in bright colors. It wasn't just a waterway anymore, it was a living monument to the people who built it, owned it, and believed in it. So I'll ask you, if your town helped build something that changed life forever, would you want your name on it? Would you fight to protect it? Let me know in the comments, and share this moment with someone who still thinks big dreams can't survive the desert. What happens when a nation proves the experts wrong? The world starts paying attention. Within the first season of operation, the canal irrigated over 500,000 hectares, 500,000 football fields of revived farmland. Agricultural output in some regions jumped 60%. Cotton, once on the brink of collapse, returned to export markets. Villages reported a 40% drop in child malnutrition. Livestock herds doubled in less than 2 years because there was finally grass to graze. But the impact wasn't just domestic. Delegations from Mali, Niger, and Benin arrived to study the model, discussing cross-border water-sharing agreements that had been unthinkable a decade ago. African media hailed it as proof that the continent could tackle mega-projects without waiting for foreign approval or loans. In the U.S., large-scale projects often become symbols of national capability: the Hoover Dam, the interstate highway system. But here's the difference. Those projects were born in an industrial superpower. Burkina Faso did this while ranked among the 20 poorest nations on Earth. And they did it debt-free. That success sparked its own backlash. Some international analysts warned of regional water politics and resource militarization, implying that self-reliance could destabilize power balances. Yet for many Africans, that was the point: shifting the balance away from dependency. So let me ask you, if a small nation in the Sahel can fund and build its own water lifeline, what excuse do richer countries have for neglecting their own infrastructure? Drop your thoughts and share this with someone who believes change can only come from the top. Some legacies are carved in stone, others in steel. This one is written in water. As the sun set over the canal's banks, the surface turned to molten gold. Traoré stood quietly, no speeches, no fanfare, just watching the water move. For once, it wasn't about him. It was about the farmers now planting 2 crops a year, the children walking to school with full bottles instead of empty jugs, the mothers who no longer counted the days until the well ran dry. In total, the canal has the capacity to deliver over 200 million gallons daily, enough to support millions of people and keep the country's agricultural backbone alive for generations. The economic ripple effect is already visible. New markets, new jobs, and a growing sense that the nation's future is, quite literally, in its own hands. From an American perspective, it's a reminder that the most powerful infrastructure isn't just concrete and machinery. It's the collective belief that something better is possible, and the will to build it together. Final twist. And maybe that's the real message here. It was never just about water. It was about proving that no desert, whether of sand, of resources, or of hope, lasts forever when people decide to change their story. So here's my challenge to you. If this story moves you, don't let it stop at inspiration. Share it. Talk about it. Ask your leaders why bold ideas are always too big until someone else makes them happen. And remember, if a nation in the Sahel can carve a river through the desert, maybe the only thing standing between us and our own transformations is the will to start.